What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Age of Quarantine. My name is David Castillo from Saint Vitus. Happy Monday. We are going to be live with none other than Aaron Turner, who basically needs no introduction, from ISIS, Sumac, and a host of other amazing projects. Also the impresario behind Hydra Head Records, and also now Sides Records, along with his wife Faith, who also does Mammofer with him. I mean, the catalog, the CV is fucking long, and it's really exciting to get to talk to him. I hope everybody out there is doing all right in this fucking wild-ass world that we're living in. Cheers, a little whiskey for you. And hopefully Aaron will be joining us real soon. All right, connecting. Aaron Turner, the one, the only. How are you?
Hello, Dave. I'm all right.
It's been quite some time, man. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. It's always nice to see a face these days that isn't the same faces you're seeing every day. Not that I don't enjoy seeing those faces, but
there's a Groundhog's Day-ness to
yes,
it, for sure.
Indeed.
So, Aaron, I start these off just pretty simply, and now that this is wearing on, I think longer than I ever anticipated, it's kind of harder to answer this question, but do you know where you would be if you weren't at home right now?
I think I would be wrapping up an Old Man Gloom tour in Europe right now. Either it would be about to end, or I think we'd be on our way home. I don't know. I stopped checking the calendar for events that were supposed to happen because it just got to be disheartening.
Yeah, I mean, the same here too. I'm just kind of like, all right, I can't even look at that. So many missed things and opportunities and all that, you know, we'll put that behind us for sure. So I want to start at the beginning. We start these as an hour-long kind of musical journey. And
sure.
I'd like to start, honestly, just going back to childhood, because I feel like there's always some really interesting experiences when you're a little kid that kind of attract you to music and what those are. So what were some of the earliest, moments you remember being like, music's for me?
I mean, I grew up in a household where I heard music a lot. My dad especially, he had a pretty extensive collection of jazz LPs and some classical. And my mom had some folk music, and those were all on pretty heavy rotation. So that was kind of my initial exposure to music, which of course, as a kid, you just take for granted. It's what's in your environment. You don't spend too much time thinking about it. I do think that said, though, that even though it was just kind of at the periphery of my consciousness, then that inevitably had an effect on me. Just hearing that music, being in a household that listened to music, even the ritual of records going on. I mean, I remember my dad getting up to put on records when dinner was being made. And, that's still, that's a ritual that occurs in my household now. So for me, music definitely started with family. I have a brother, my brother Charlie, and my sister Jessie. Both are musicians as well, and both primarily singers and guitar players. So seeing them around when they were around playing guitar and singing had an effect on me as well, I think. And those were the first instruments I touched too, were their guitars. They would let me pick them up and fool around with them. I have to say that my brother was especially instrumental in that regard. In terms of my musical development, I remember very clearly getting a Maxell tape from him that had Zeppelin on one side and Hendrix on the other. And I think that tape, along with a couple others, were the first things that were mine and that really got me actively interested in music. One of the other ones was Thriller. I remember getting a cassette of Thriller. My grandmother bought it for me. I think she was not too thrilled about the idea, but she indulged me and let me have it. And those were kind of the early things where I really became conscious of music, actively wanted to listen to it, spent time looking at the covers, at least in the case of Thriller. And in the case of the Maxell tape for my brother, just looking at the song titles and
Two
starting to
really
have,
different things there too, right? Because one's
yeah,
like this manicured pop, like it's got the whole thing. Another thing is just like a mixtape. Two
yeah.
really different representations. I mean, I remember like me and my best friend Josh, who we're still really tight, like brothers when we were like 5. Josh took a black Sharpie marker and started coloring in his white T-shirt so it could be a black T-shirt, like Michael Jackson and stuff like that. So early devotion to the
Yeah.
to those sort of kind of pop idols and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was kind of like your introduction, and that was even an introduction to just playing an instrument. Did you feel like any sort of kinship towards a guitar right away, or was it just kind of something that happened a little bit later for you?
So before I started actively playing guitar, I joined my elementary school band playing snare drum, and I did not connect with it. And I gotta say, in retrospect, part of it was the fact that the drum I had didn't sound right. I came to understand later that it just didn't have the snares on properly, so it just made like this kind of impotent sounding, almost like tom sound instead of like the satisfying crack of a snare. And this other kid in the school band had like a nice Ludwig snare that his parents had gotten him. And I didn't understand then, because I was in 3rd grade. I was like, why does it sound good when he plays drums, but it sounds like shit when I'm playing this thing?
You're like, I'm horrible.
Yeah. So had I gotten a good sounding snare, it might have been a different scenario. But in retrospect, maybe it wouldn't have mattered, because once I did start playing guitar, that was it. It became an obsession for me. Yeah, it wasn't kind of like this casual thing where I just started doing it and didn't really think much of it. It was like once somebody showed me how to play the introduction to One on guitar, that was it for me. And then it was just like, okay, I'm in my bedroom many hours a day just playing guitar.
Just fucking doing it. So was that like, what was that kind of the early introduction to kind of heavier music, Metallica, things of that nature? How did you start kind of getting into kind of music that you'll later be known for?
So just as a quick timeline, the mixtape for my brother was with Hendrix and Zeppelin, and 2 tapes I also got in 3rd grade, Motley Crue, Girls, 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 and Beastie Boys, License to Ill, which I gotta say, basically the introductory track, No Sleep to Brooklyn, that was it for me. Like the rest of the record, it was fine and I listened to it, but it was like that first song with like the heavy guitar and the Kerry King solo, that really reeled me in. And that led into just more like pop metal for a while, Guns N' Roses, Poison, that kind of stuff. And then
it was the 80s, man.
Yeah. And then I gotta credit this guy, Ramon, who worked at a local record store where I lived in Santa Fe. I came into the store and I told him that I was really into Guns N' Roses. And so he gave me And Justice for All, and said, all right, if you like this, try this. And I took that home. And I think like 2 weeks later, I went back and got Master of Puppets. So like once I figured out there was something more extreme than Guns N' Roses, that was like the gateway to Slayer and Megadeth and kind of the big 80s thrash stuff. Subsequently, a few years later, I went back, same guy, Ramon, gave me Symphonies of Sickness, and that one, I gotta say, I didn't gravitate to it immediately. It kind of like freaked me out more than it engaged me. But I clearly remember the first time I put it on and I couldn't even decipher what was happening at first. And that was really, that was almost more interesting to me in retrospect than immediately liking something.
I totally agree with you. 100%,
yeah.
Because some of my stuff that I really liked, like when I first heard it, it either didn't connect or it like kind of freaked me out. I was just like, like ass suck. I don't understand this, man. Like I'm into punk and like hardcore.
Yeah.
And then later on, I realized I was like, I started moving more towards that. And then I was like, wait, I've heard stuff like this before.
Yeah.
And it kind of started to connect more, right?
Yeah. And again, for me, that was also a repeated experience. Like I remember seeing a Godflesh video on Headbangers Ball. And that was the first time I'd heard Godflesh. And I wondered what that fuck I was seeing and hearing. And every single time I had an experience like that later on, where I heard something and didn't know if I immediately liked it or not, and felt kind of actually anxious and freaked out hearing it, that was the stuff that ended up having the biggest impact on me. That happened again when I first started listening to noise music. Like the first time I heard Merzbow, it was intriguing to me. And at that point I was entering this phase where I just was kind of wanting extremities. So I appreciated it on that level. But again, it was just sort of like the first exposure was shocking and anxiety inducing, but that became the doorway to wanting to understand what I was hearing and trying to figure out why it was interesting to me.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And did you feel like, I talk often on this program about like getting almost into like an arms race with yourself. Like, I'm like, that's cool, but then that satisfied me. Now I have an itch to find something that's even heavier or even more obtuse or something like that. And you just kind of keep digging. Did you just go back to Ramon and keep asking for more?
No, I kind of, once I understood that there was this underground network, and this is all, we're kind of jumping across different eras, but in high school, there was a friend of mine who had an older brother who was into punk and hardcore. And everything filtered down from him through our little circle of friends. That was basically, about 5 or 6 of us. And that was how I got to understand that there was like this whole underground network. And that was what set me off into, wanting to actively participate in the realm of music rather than just sort of being an appreciative bystander. And my interest, I guess, in terms of I don't know how to put this exactly. It wasn't just about sonic extremity. It was also sort of about the confrontational social aspect of it as well. I mean, that was certainly part of what attracted me to metal, was understanding that it was confrontational. It was meant to piss people off. It was meant to drive people away, the people who didn't understand it. And later on, like in high school, that got a little more, that sort of confrontational thing became a little more deep, in the sense that it wasn't just about pissing people off. I really started to understand the countercultural subversive value of punk and hardcore. It wasn't just about trying to, drive your parents away. It was about understanding that if there were things in the world that bothered you, if there were things that you viewed as sort of antithetical to your own existence, if there were things that didn't make sense, then there was this network of musicians and zines who were exploring countercultural political ideas. And so that became interesting to me as well, like the political and social aspects.
I mean, I think at a lot of shows back in the day, and I think, maybe for some of our younger viewers who grew up with the internet more so and stuff like that, but every merch table would be like a merch table worth of stuff, and then like a merch table full of ideas, basically, of like zines and maybe a political organization or two or something else. And that drew me in a lot as well, where I'm like, I feel like I'm connecting this art to a larger framework of sort of points of view. And it was like not exactly what you could sort of find, not in my classroom that I was going to every day or anything like that. So that kind of got me definitely really excited. When you kind of made that transition to kind of saying, oh, like I want to be like a willing participant of this whole sort of thing, is that when you started trying to, formulate bands and do stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I tried and failed to start a band when I was still living in New Mexico. I mean, the pool of musicians there was tiny, and even tinier for the types of music that my friends and I were interested in. We had a few amazing local bands, most notably Logical Nonsense, who put out a few records on Alternative Tentacles. but they were kind of, I mean, them and a small group of other folks were already spoken for, in the sense that they were playing together already. Most of them were a few years older than me. And a lot of them too didn't really want to bother with me and my group of friends, because we were specifically into straight edge hardcore. I mean, we liked other stuff, but we were calling ourselves straight edge. We were Xing up, and these dudes were, you know, they were into drinking and smoking weed and doing whatever else. And so they didn't want to play with the young straight edge guys, basically. So there was me. Yeah, there was me who played guitar. And then there was a handful of my other friends who didn't play anything, or only wanted to play bass or only wanted to sing. So it was like, what are you going to do without a drummer? And that was the biggest problem. It was like, I couldn't start a band without a drummer. We tried. We had practices with dudes singing and guys playing bass out of practice amps without drummers, and that offered a certain sort of satisfaction. But it really wasn't until I moved out of Santa Fe that I was able to start playing in a band more actively. However, that said, while I was still in Santa Fe, I did start doing a distro. You mentioned distro tables a while ago, and I remember reading in the back of I think it was a Heart Attack zine. It said write for a wholesale list, and so I wrote for a wholesale list. Found out I could get these records at a cheap cost. Started buying from them. Started buying out stuff from a few other small distros and setting up a table at the shows, local shows. Doing zines with a few of my friends. So we were participating. We were being productive, and all of that was satisfying for me, and it did feel like a level of engagement that made me feel like I was active and productive and part of something. And again, that was one of the most important facets for me, was that this was a way to connect with other people who shared similar interests, to share ideas, and to, I mean, really inspire each other to make music and make art.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's important to note, that like this whole thing is this ecosystem, and it has so many different facets to it, and you can play a role in so many different ways. You know, like I play, but I mean, I book shows, you have labels, you do different things, and we all need to do these various different things and work with one another to make this whole world of music work. So I think it's important to always highlight that stuff, and for people trying to find their way into the underground music scene, different things like that, there are many talents that you can bring to it. Most people have something to offer, I think.
Yeah, and you know, in small scenes like the one I grew up in Santa Fe, you didn't really have the choice to maybe just do one thing. You had to do everything if you wanted stuff to happen, and that's what I was doing, and that's what a lot of people were doing. They were booking shows, they were calling people on the phone, they were having shows at their house. People were doing zines and trading zines with people, and you know, bands bringing their records through on tour was one of the only ways at that point that you could get some people's records. I mean, the idea of being able to buy a record off the internet and hear it before, you know, you had even purchased it was still quite a long ways off. So it was very hands-on, it was very grassroots. And I think that all of the effort required is part of what made it such a powerful engagement for me, and for all, you know, for a lot of the people that were participating. The fact that you had to work for it, and that you had to understand what it was, at least to some extent, and that you had to make the effort to connect with other people was a big part of the reward. And also, I think for people, you know, like myself, who didn't have another way of socializing, this was about connection to community.
Sure, yeah.
And building community.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the ethos that we've tried to take at Saint Vitus, and the lessons that we've learned from the whole entire thing, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, so we've left, and now we're in Massachusetts for university, pretty much. Right?
Yeah, I went to art school in Boston, and part of the attraction was the East Coast Underground. I mean, a lot of the records that I had been ordering from mail order catalogs were coming from places on the East Coast, and I knew that by being in Boston, I was in close proximity to New York. I would be close to Connecticut, and Rhode Island, places that were having DIY festivals and had a lot of all ages venues. And even some of the bands that I was already into were all based there. So I knew that this would be a hub for me where I could potentially reach all these other places and other networks. And that was really important to me, to be in a place that, offered that. And again, this was, still basically pre-internet days. Geographical location was very helpful in that regard. Sure. And that was the way that it was easiest to make connections outside of the whole tape trading, zine trading thing.
Totally. So when you went there, was there obviously you were there for school to a degree, but I feel like you obviously picked it for its sort of larger context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your life would be, right?
Yeah.
But was it always like, hey, I'm going to get there and I'm going to find the people to start a band, or did it just kind of happen a little bit more casually?
It wasn't casual in the sense that I was going there with that idea in mind. How it happened in terms of finding people to play with and finding people whose records I wanted to put out was a much more organic process, and it did just stem from going to shows, and that started even in the summer before I moved out to Boston. I went to Massachusetts and stayed with my sister who was living there at the time. I went to a show. I went to go see Earth Crisis, and opening was Cave In. And this was like, must have been 95, I think. Yeah, it was 95. And I remember seeing the Cave In guys who were my age, in fact, a little younger. And their show was even more interesting to me than Earth Crisis, the band I came to see. And that, for me, I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of me of tapping into the network that eventually became sort of the Hydra Head community, the Massachusetts scene, essentially, that sort of helped me find my way into the world of music out there, and also make some of the friends that I've had since then.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just growing through that, obviously, Oh Man Gloom sports a lot of that kind of personnel from a lot of different bands out there in Massachusetts, and then obviously ISIS as well.
Yeah.
And you guys meeting there. How did that kind of start off as far as ISIS kind of coming together and then, starting to, kind of reach? Because to me, ISIS is such a conceptual band. I'm almost like, did they just jam this out? Did they have a point of view going in? What was that like?
One of the bands that I was also initially very drawn to when I moved to Massachusetts was Cable. And I saw Cable. Yeah, I saw Cable quite a few times, and they were an interesting combination of noise rock and metal and hardcore. And the fact that they weren't easily identifiable as any of those things made them very intriguing to me. And it was through going to see Cable that I met Jeff Kashid, who was, I think, the original bass player for Cable, and played with them up until the first album, essentially. So it was through Cable that I met Jeff. And I don't remember how Jeff and I came to become roommates, but at some point that's what happened. And when we were living together, we discussed starting a band together. Both of us had been in other bands in Boston, and none of what we had done was particularly satisfying. It was basically either just starting bands and having it be sort of my first band kind of situation, where you're just learning to actually be in a band and what that means.
Yeah.
Or it was participating in other people's bands where you were just playing what they were showing you. And that wasn't what either Jeff or I wanted to do. We wanted to form our own band, and we had a common ground in terms of the kind of music that we both enjoyed. And we really wanted to use those influences kind of as the template for what we were doing with ISIS. And there was kind of a simple set of parameters, very rudimentary parameters. We knew we wanted long songs. We knew we wanted to play low. We knew we wanted to play loud. And we knew that we wanted the records to be thematically and conceptually tied together. Not just a collection of songs, but unified experiences that had a narrative that went from one point to another in a creative trajectory.
Sure, yeah, because I mean, to me, it was like every song was just kind of like a movement of like a larger piece. And at the time where I really started to encounter ISIS and just really kind of think about it, I was like, wow, like this to me is like, it's almost like Pink Floyd or something, but for metalheads. Like in a way, it just like it had the artwork, the over-encompassing thing to it, not sonically speaking, but the way it was sort of presented. And I feel like it was the first music in a long time because I had just been listening to short, punchier, heavier songs for so long that I was finding myself getting lost in.
Yeah.
But in the context that I felt like comfortable and culturally in a way, you know, like,
yeah,
like some hippie shit, like
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, formative music for me was Hendrix and Zeppelin and some things that were, you know, more epic in nature and at times, you know, kind of unhinged and even psychedelic. So that was certainly, at least for me, in the background of what we were doing from the outset of ISIS. And I know for Jeff, Pink Floyd was probably certainly there. I actually didn't come to Pink Floyd until later in life. But I know that was there for him. And then there were other things too. Swans was another one. Neurosis was another one. Bands that had not only a very well-defined musical aesthetic, but also a visual aesthetic, an ideological grounding, and a almost turning a band into a way of life. And that was extremely influential for us, and it was sort of the blueprint for how we chose to do things once ISIS actually became a thing.
When you started in, like, what was the buy-in like? When you talk about a band as a way of life, that's a high level of commitment, high level of buy-in right away. So you and Jeff right away just like, we're going to, you know, just take this to the nth degree and find out in this? Or how did that kind of develop? Because, you know, I think for certain folks, it kind of was like, yeah, we're doing something and it becomes cooler and cooler. It starts sucking them in. But to have that, I think, as the outset point of view is pretty dramatic.
Well, I'll put it this way. We never had the intention of being a careerists. We didn't imagine the band turning into our livelihood. The idea more was just that we were obsessed with music and we were going to devote our lives to making our band the best it could be. And everything else was kind of peripheral. You know, I mean, everybody in ISIS, at least for the first, I think 6 or 7 years of the band, were working full-time jobs outside of the band and or going to school. And all of us had relationships with, you know, with short-term partners for the most part, but really all of us just wanted to be in a band, and not just be in a band, but really devote ourselves to writing music, to playing shows, and to developing the public persona of the band. And by that, I mean, you know, kind of the things that are all related to the central focus of the music, the artwork, the other bands we wanted to be associated with because we had a shared ideology or shared aesthetics, and making connections with other people who are doing things that were facilitating music, like booking shows or releasing records. And so in that way, it was kind of all consuming. And I think that is part of why we were able to eventually just stop having day jobs and do the band full time.
Sure, because you were just constantly aligning the rest of your lives to kind of focus in on that as it taking more and more time, right? Like there's always, I feel like for creative people, there's always this economy of time that we're sort of fighting against in a way, whether it's like how much we can do versus the things in our personal lives and then economics and stuff like that. So
yeah,
the tricky thing, right?
it is. And again, that was never, I mean, we didn't even, there was almost like no internal acknowledgement of when we made the switch from being people with day jobs who played in a band to being in a band, and that was all we did. It was never like, okay guys, I think it's time we got to step it up. Here's the next thing we do in this process of being a professional band. It was more just like, we just kept doing what we wanted to do. And the fact that we were very passionate about the music is what led to us being able to do it as, I guess, as a career, essentially. And, you know, I have to say a lot of it was also just putting in the hours. You know, I remember days where people would show up at practice after work. And at this point, even early on, I was pretty much only doing Hydra Head. So my schedule was whatever I determined it to be, but pretty much everyone else for the most part was working like a 9 to 5. And I remember people showing up at practice and just being burned out after a long day of work, but still wanting to play music and finding that the music at the end of a long day kind of made everything else worth it. And in all of my years of doing this and in making connections with other people who have kind of built their lives around music, most of the people I know who have been able to, if not make a living from music, at the very least build their lives around music, have been of a similar mindset where it wasn't like a hobbyist thing. It wasn't about cultivating a certain kind of image that they, you know, wanted to have of being a cool musician. It was more just about a slavish devotion and even an inability to do anything other than music. I mean, when I think about it, a lot of the people I know, myself included, really weren't capable of doing anything else. We had to do this.
Yeah, it's more of a calling, a vocational kind of desire that it's hard to explain, but it's like you just are like, everything else is not really holding my attention besides this.
Yeah, and not only that, but it's like, what else could I do? I mean, and the idea
I've asked myself that question a lot during this.
Yeah, no shit.
I'm like,
yeah, and part of it too is just feeling, and I can't say this is true for everyone, but I will say that this is true of most of the people who I'm very close to and most of the people that I have spent time making music with. There is a withering of the soul that occurs when music isn't happening, when for whatever reason you cannot do music. It is the sustenance for living that is necessary almost as much as food and shelter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like, yeah, the communal participation of music and what we can do with that is obviously a fundamental tenet of my life as well. And yeah, it's fucking, it's an intense desire when it really hits you, and it's something that it's your North Star. It's like you can't derivate from sort of that path, and then it bleeds into the other sort of aspects of life, like you were just referencing Hydra Head too. It's like you do Hydra Head all day, which has its own, you know, set of tasks and things like that, but it's still revolving around music, and then you go play too. Even though it's still in the same world, it's like operationally and mentally almost accessing different things. It's like same thing for me if I'm going to booking shows and doing stuff like that, to playing in primitive weapons or doing something else like that. It's turning on and off different switches, but it's all in the same world, right?
It is, and it's for me, it's literally shaped my entire life. I mean, every person, almost without exception, that I have retained lifelong connections to are people I played music with or still play music with. The person I'm married to, Faith, I met her because of music. And everything that I have been able to do as an adult in my life, like seeing other places in the world, and again, making connections with people in those places, has been made possible because of music. I would even say that our son, our child, would not have been born if I had not made my life about music. So literally, I cannot look anywhere in my life and see, let me put it this way. I look at everything in my life and I can see how it was shaped by my choice to spend my life playing music, connecting with other people through music, facilitating music made by other people, choosing to become a part of and help foster a community of musicians and artists.
Sure. So as ISIS is sort of happening and that's growing and stuff like that, you decide to do Hydra Head. And did that just seem like the logical extension of creating this community around the music that you're creating and kind of bringing up like-minded artists with yourself? Or how did that come to pass?
Hydra Head actually predated ISIS by a couple of years. I
Right.
tried to start Hydra Head when I was still in New Mexico. In fact, I believe that I started calling the distro that I was doing when I was still in my senior year of high school. I called it Hydra Head. So it existed before I even moved to Boston, and I had even tried to release records before I left, but it didn't actually happen until I moved to the East Coast. And again, that was part of my desire to be a participant in this musical network. And also part of it had to do with my mutual interest in visual art and in music. I mean, going back to just much earlier in our conversation, talking about formative things for me, getting metal records and looking at the cover art. I mean, the cover art was at least 30% of the attraction. I mean, it really was. And the two things informed each other. The character of the music was further developed by looking at the visuals that were associated with it. And a lot of my exercises as a fledgling artist were copying metal logos. I mean, you know, copying comic books and copying metal logos was an integral part of my training as a visual artist. So the idea for a record label came from doing a distro table and realizing that there was a whole group of people that were putting out records for other interesting bands, wanting to make connections with other artists, and by wanting to design record sleeves. I thought that, you know, finding a band, getting their record pressed, designing their cover, and helping get it out into the world was like this amazing thing that it was even possible to do. I mean, it just, you know, that just lit up my brain to think that, you know, one person, by choosing to connect with other people, could do that on their own. It took the element of inaccessibility out of the game. I mean, I remember going to see Slayer and being this little tiny guy in this, you know, big sea of people and these monolithic characters up on stage. And as satisfying as that was, there was also some kind of disconnect that happened for me. And then fast forward to a couple years later, I'm in somebody's tiny house, a band is playing there, selling shirts that they screened themselves, talking to you after the show. Suddenly that gulf between bystander and participant went,
Yeah.
and that was amazing. It was like this, I was given permission and I was given the tools to be able to become a musician, become a record label person, become part of something that I was included in, rather than, I guess, the more kind of subservient relationship that exists between big band and little fan.
Sure, yeah, definitely. And then again, in more of a communal, or like, kind of an experience where you're also able to find things and use sort of the acumen that you've built up artistically, visually, and also knowing the things that you're taking from being part of the band that increased in being successful and learning things, and also learning from people who are also on your label, and just, building them up alongside yourself has to be super satisfying. I'm thinking about Oxbow, I'm thinking about Daughters, I'm thinking about so many great artists that have come out on Hydra Head over the years.
Well, with Hydra Head initially, it was really just about finding bands that were willing to work with me and who didn't have records yet. Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to be able to put out records early on for bands that I really truly loved. That said, there were also some things in the early catalog that I liked enough to put my energy into, but it wasn't like the be all end all for me. It didn't start with like the very first thing I put out was not my favorite band of all time. However, eventually, after years, a couple of years of doing Hydra Head, I was able to start putting out bands who were my favorite bands. And also the process of working with some of these bands made them into my favorite bands, getting to know the people behind them, what they were like, what their frame of mind was, all those things, developing friendships. That was really what made it so invigorating for me to do that. And at some point I did also recognize that Hydra Head had a platform. We had an audience that was devoted enough that we could present something to them and they would investigate it simply because we were involved with it. And when I realized that was the case, it became even more important to me to try to facilitate releases for artists that I felt like, deserved more than what they were getting. And, I can't say that we always served everybody well. I know that we had our shortcomings for sure. But that said, it did mean a lot to me, to be able to put out records for people who didn't have a home elsewhere, and to see that, by our efforts, we were able to help them, gain a wider audience, or, at least get their records into stores.
Sure.
I do think that the desire to help people was central to wanting to do the label. And that wasn't in this kind of patronizing way that I feel like it could come off as. It was really more just understanding that in order for this to be a vibrant, diverse, and interesting community, we all needed to help each other. And I felt like there was this whole avenue of interesting bands who didn't necessarily fit into one genre or subgenre neatly, but who were doing something that was really vital and interesting. So it was kind of like this home for idiosyncratic, very adventurous music.
Yeah, and honestly, Hydra Head was something that to me always resonated, because I thought there was like enough of a point of view where I could follow the strain, but I'm not going to get the same thing over and over again. But it's going to be a kind of like a similar maybe diaspora of people making really intense, fucked up, weird, cool music. And I'm not expecting the same thing over and over again. And honestly, it was an inspiration for the venue, along with like some other things from New York City, where I'm like, I want to present music of a wide enough range, but maybe some people can see this thread that can kind of present some sort of commonality to it, but like, enjoy all of these different flavors of this. Like they're out there and they're really fucking great.
Yeah. And again, just with the realization that there was a platform that we had, was the realization that we could also help broaden people's spectrum. And that was really important to me. I mean, growing up where I did in New Mexico, we did not have the option of just liking one kind of music. If you wanted to go to a show and there were only shows like maybe once or twice a month, you would go see death metal, you would go see punk, you would go see ska, you would go see, you know, whatever it was, as long as it had kind of that underground stamp of being countercultural and being made by people who are doing it themselves, that was the important thing. So this idea that there should be this stylistic set of parameters that you fit in and that's all you like, that was a luxury that we didn't have. And I don't even know that that would have been something that I would have wanted to adopt anyway. But I was kind of surprised when I moved to the East Coast and I found that there were certain people who would only go see like the straight edge hardcore shows, or, you know, like there was people that, you know, would only go to specific venues because they felt like that venue was, you know, spoke to them in some way. For me, that was just like, that was cutting yourself off from the wider experience that was available. And so that I think that formative experience in New Mexico really had a lot to do with what happened with the label later, where I wasn't going to choose to limit the label to one specific kind of music and only do that.
Sure.
I think that would have made it ultimately a stunted and possibly even short-lived enterprise. The fact that the label grew and evolved and that we chose to keep pursuing different avenues with it is what helped it last as long as it did, I think.
Totally. And I feel like that's kind of, and you can see the ethos here being applied across the board. There's like this slow growth, carefully curated, you know, point of view of just, you know, creating something that's sort of an encompassing thing, whether it's the label, ISIS, the band at that moment, and then moving forward. So moving forward a bit, I remember too that, you know, at a certain point, I felt like heavy music was in a very like nebulous zone where it wasn't really being covered so much by a lot of different kind of outlets and stuff like that. You know, there feels there was a lot of big like kind of indie press, but it never really covered heavy music and stuff like that. Felt like ISIS sort of started to bridge the gap a little bit before its demise, where you guys are playing like art museums and all sorts of different sort of angles and venues, and the crowds are starting to get bigger. Was there any moment where you were just like, wow, like there's certain people that are starting to attend our shows that maybe we're starting to speak a broader language here?
I mean, I definitely noticed when the size of our shows increased, but I will say we purposely started from the very beginning of ISIS. We purposely started touring when we had the option of taking other bands on tour. We purposely started curating diverse bills. And that was, the intention behind that was twofold. One was to expose our audience to different things, and the other intention was to diversify our own audience. The idea of, and this goes back to what we were just talking about, the idea of a homogenous audience was completely uninteresting, and that had to do with the fact that our music was not coming from a homogenous standpoint. We weren't just trying to ape one specific style of music. We were incorporating so many different things that we all enjoyed individually and collectively, and trying to make that into this unified experience. So the idea of purposely playing to one type of audience never appealed to us. And that was part of the reason why a lot of the time, even when we had opportunities, we purposely opted out of doing package tours, where it was like, you know, all bands kind of a stylistic similarity. It just, it wasn't appealing. And I don't think that ultimately it really would have benefited us. I mean, I think the fact that we tried to, you know, push ourselves out of one specific pigeonhole and also invite other people into our realm as part of the reason it worked as well as it did.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, and I think that the appeal too, not limiting the appeal of the band, because it should be presented in front of a lot of people. Let them make their own judgments for what it is or isn't on their own. And I don't like to think that any artist would make those judgments for other people, right? I'm
yeah,
like, if you want to put the best death metal band in the world, whomever they may be, like up in front of a ton of millions of people, let it. That's a great band. You know what I mean? Whether we want to like it or not, that doesn't really matter. I think it's more about the exposure and just being like, this is art, and like, okay, let's just be on this playing field.
yeah, and I will say that uh, we did make choices based around what we felt like was artistically valid, and that requires some judgment, and in some cases, um, ours wasn't always the best. But I don't want to say that we were just kind of choosing things blindly in an idea with the idea that the broader the audience, the better the audience. It really was more about what was challenging, because challenging is interesting. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, when I discovered that music didn't just have to be confrontational, it could be subversive. And that idea of subversion carried over into what we chose to do with Hydra Head and also with ISIS, subverting audience expectations. And that is the only way, in my mind, that progression has ever been possible, is by people being willing to subvert the even the exact environment that they are in that may have allowed them to come into existence. Without that willingness to kind of defy the contemporary paradigm that you're a part of, nothing will move forward. And that's why I was always kind of confused when, maybe not necessarily confused, but kind of annoyed by people's insistence that certain things weren't metal, for instance. I mean, that's a very simplified example, but like, I remember this was leveled at ISIS, at Cave-In, at Converge, at Neurosis, when they stopped being like a hardcore punk band and started doing something else. There was a lot of people that were very put off by it. And I never understood why people who loved metal, who loved punk, who loved hardcore would get so rankled when a band they liked would incorporate something else that they weren't doing before. I mean, how do people think that metal came to be in the first place? It wasn't because metal existed and then a bunch of people just copied it. It was because people decided to tune their strings down and turn their amps up way too fucking loud and use feedback. And without those decisions of willing subversion, evolution, and the existence of all the things that people appreciate wouldn't be possible. So again, that was part of our idea. It was like, okay, if we want to progress, if we want to do something new, if we want to help break new ground, then you have to take risks, and you have to be willing to do what a lot of people would consider commercial suicide,
Sure.
by purposely and constantly destroying your own brand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I remember Pepper Keenan talking about when he took over COC, and obviously trying to change the style. And I always just remember he was giving this interview, and he goes, it's kind of cool when you piss off your own scene. And he did it in the Pepper Keenan kind of way, and I was just like, that's pretty sick. So we don't have much time left. So I first of all, Mammofer is amazing. We all love Sumac. Everyone in the comments loves Sumac. But the last time I saw Sumac, I'm going to jump here because we're going to have to do a part 2. The CV is too long for an hour. The CV is too long. But there's something that you said after a show at Saint Vitus, and I believe it's the one that was recorded that you just put out on the record label, which is all on Bandcamp. donating to Black Lives Matter, which is a very beautiful thing and a really great gesture of solidarity. But one thing that you said about heavy music, and you repeated it in interviews, that you feel that it comes from a place of love, or at least the things that you do come from, and you're creating is coming from a place of love. I think maybe for a lot of other people, maybe people not from the scene or whatever, find that to be antithetical, but could you just talk about that concept a little bit?
So the thing that I liked about metal when I first encountered it was the very energetic, visceral, and primal energy that seemed to be at the core of the music and in my connection to it. And to me, that is proof of the vitality of the music and the very strong current of life that is flowing through the people who are making it. And I do think that in a lot of cases, music, and also metal music, is part of what has saved people, myself included to some extent, from basically being self-destructive. Of course, the argument could be made that, you know, by being a career musician, you enter into a very self-destructive lifestyle. But I happen to believe that a lot of people who kind of live that self-destructive lifestyle as a musician would have had an even more self-destructive life if they had not discovered music. So for me, metal and music in general was a literal lifeline. And it has given my life purpose, and love of life is essential to staying alive and to engaging with life on a really meaningful level. And I also think that there is I've talked about this with a few other people, there is something about the death facet of metal that is like an affirmation of life. By exploring death, by looking at what it is that is the opposite of life, it's almost a confirmation of the fact that we are alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not to get too crazy here, but it's Heidegger. It's it's like being towards death, or, you know, living towards death. And that was the concept that he sort of said, and it's kind of in that regard, right? If you always have death as that sort of companion, then you can kind of understand the life a little bit better. And I think that that's what really always drew me as well, because I want to live a life that maybe can stand up to like a glorious death. And that's, I think, maybe what we can hope for, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I have never, I mean, there are certain aspects of my personal life where I've experienced this as well. But one of the things that has made me feel most connected, and I'm not going to define my own personal belief system too much here, but one of the things.
Hey, Aaron, I want to give you the 1 minute mark.
Yeah.
1 minute.
One of the things that has made me feel the most alive in my life, and one of the things that has made me feel the most connected to other people, is the communal act of playing and listening to music. And to me, that is kind of the ultimate expression of love. And it is for me the reason in a lot of ways for living. So that's kind of why I've tried to emphasize that point over and over, is metal doesn't have to be nihilism, and you can engage with dark topics, but that for me is not the end point of it. It needs to go beyond that.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And, I just want to thank you for taking this time out. We'll definitely have to do a part 2 because the CV is long for Mr. Turner. So thank you so much for hanging out with us. And I always appreciate these insights. And that's why we're doing these interviews, just to get a little piece of that. So thank you so much, Aaron. I'll talk to you soon, and I'll get at you about doing a part 2 because there's way too much more to cover.
Thanks, Dave.
Have a good one, man. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.